Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The scorching heat of August 1987 had settled over our small county like a suffocating blanket. I was 3 years into my career as a sheriff's deputy, still carrying the eager determination of youth, but beginning to understand the weight that comes with wearing the badge. At 26, I thought I'd seen enough of human nature's darker side through domestic disputes and bar fights, but nothing had prepared me for what was waiting in those ancient woods. My uncle had been the one to suggest I volunteer for search and rescue duty. "You've got the stamina for it," he'd said, "and the heart." What he didn't mention was how the screaming silence of missing persons cases would follow you home. How you'd wake up in cold sweats wondering if you'd missed some crucial detail that could have saved a life. The phone rang at the station that Tuesday morning, August 18th, cutting through the humid air like a blade. Sheriff Rodriguez handed me the receiver with a grim expression that I'd come to recognize. Another missing persons case. "Deputy Morrison speaking," I answered, already reaching for my notepad. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez from Phoenix, Arizona. Her words came in rushed, panicked bursts between barely controlled sobs. Her husband Vicente, age 54, and their 9-year-old grandson Diego had driven up to our mountain region the previous Thursday for what was supposed to be a 4-day camping and fishing trip. They should have returned Sunday evening. It was now Tuesday, and she hadn't heard a word from them. "Vicente always calls," she kept repeating, her voice breaking. "Every night when he's away, he calls to check in. Always. Even when the phone service is bad, he finds a way. Something's wrong. I can feel it in my bones." As I took down the details, their planned route, the make and model of their blue Ford pickup, Vicente's medical conditions, diabetes requiring daily insulin, Diego's fear of the dark, a familiar knot formed in my stomach. The boy's age hit me hardest, 9 years old. The same age I'd been when my own father took me on my first camping trip, teaching me to tie knots and identify animal tracks. Mrs. Gonzalez provided their intended campsite location, Deadwater Creek, about 15 miles into the wilderness area. It was accessible by logging roads, but surrounded by thousands of acres of dense forest that stretched toward the Canadian border. The area was known for its sudden weather changes, hidden ravines, and easy-to-miss trail markers. Even experienced hikers had gotten turned around out there. After hanging up, I stared at the topographical map pinned to the station wall. Deadwater Creek sat in a valley surrounded by steep ridges, with old-growth timber so thick that helicopters couldn't see through the canopy. If someone got lost in there, especially a diabetic man with a young child, time wasn't on our side. Sheriff Rodriguez assembled our search and rescue team within the hour. Besides myself, we had 4 other deputies. Martinez, a 15-year veteran with a tracker's instincts. Wilson, built like a linebacker but gentle as a lamb with scared kids. Torres, our communications specialist who could make radios work in dead zones. And Hansen, fresh out of the academy but eager to prove himself. Our civilian volunteer team consisted of 12 locals who knew these mountains better than their own backyards. There was Old Pete, a retired logger whose weathered hands could read terrain like Braille. The Morrison twins, no relation to me, identical brothers who ran the local outdoor gear shop. Susan Walsh, a school nurse who'd patched up more hiking accidents than our county hospital, and 8 others whose knowledge of wilderness survival had saved lives before. The real stars of our operation were the dogs, Buster and Sadie, 2 German shepherds trained in tracking and trained by the state police. Their handler, Deputy Craig Williams from the neighboring county, had driven up specifically for this search. These animals could follow a scent trail days old and had found more missing persons than the rest of us combined. We loaded our vehicles with enough supplies for a week-long search. Medical equipment, emergency shelter materials, ropes and climbing gear, extra food and water, flare guns, portable radios with extended batteries, and enough coffee to keep a small army awake. I packed my personal kit with extra care, checking and rechecking my first aid supplies, my compass, and the emergency insulin that might save Vicente's life if we found him in time. The drive to Deadwater Creek took us deeper into wilderness with each mile. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt paths barely wide enough for our vehicles. Ancient Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches interlocking to form a green ceiling that blocked out most of the sky. The temperature dropped 10 degrees as we climbed elevation, and the air grew thick with the smell of pine resin and decomposing leaves. As we bumped along the final stretch of logging road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from between the trees. Every deputy develops instincts about danger, and mine were screaming that this case would be different from the routine searches I'd participated in before. The forest seemed to press in around us, too quiet except for the rumble of our engines and the occasional crack of a branch in the wind. We reached the Deadwater Creek campground just after noon, the August sun barely penetrating the thick canopy of ancient evergreens. The campground was more of a clearing than anything else, a rough circle of packed earth surrounded by towering trees that seemed to lean inward, as if listening to secrets whispered in the center. Vicente's blue Ford pickup sat exactly where Mrs. Gonzalez said it would be, parked near the creek bank with military precision. The truck bed was empty except for a spare tire and some basic tools, nothing unusual there. What immediately caught my attention was the complete absence of sound. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. The only noise came from the creek itself, a low gurgling that sounded disturbingly like muffled conversation. Their orange dome tent was pitched about 30 feet from the truck, still standing but with the rain fly hanging loose on one side. Deputy Martinez approached it carefully, his hand resting on his service weapon out of habit. "Tent's not secured properly," he called out. "Looks like they left in a hurry." I joined him at the tent entrance, and what we found inside made my skin crawl. Everything was still there: wallet, truck keys, camping permits, a detailed topographical map with their planned hiking routes marked in red ink, bottles of water, canned food, a first aid kit, and most troubling of all, Vicente's insulin and testing kit sitting on top of his sleeping bag. A diabetic doesn't go anywhere without his medication, not willingly. The sleeping bags were unzipped and pushed aside as if both occupants had gotten up quickly in the middle of the night. Diego's small backpack contained comic books, a handheld electronic game, and a worn teddy bear with one missing eye. The sight of that bear, obviously well-loved and carried everywhere, made my chest tighten. What 9-year-old leaves his security blanket behind? Deputy Wilson was examining the cold fire pit when he called us over. "Take a look at this," he said, pointing at a small camping pot sitting on the metal grate above the ashes. The pot was half filled with water and what had once been macaroni noodles, now bloated and gray with several days of sitting. Floating on the surface was a thin film of green algae, and tiny insects had made homes in the congealed mess. "They were cooking dinner," I said, studying the scene. "This pot wouldn't sit on the grate unless the fire was still burning, which means they left while their food was still cooking." Old Pete knelt beside the fire pit and stirred the ashes with a stick. "Fire's been dead for days, 3, maybe 4, and look here." He pointed to scattered pieces of partially burned wood around the pit's perimeter. These logs were pulled out of the fire while they were still burning. See the charred ends? Someone yanked these out fast and threw them aside. The implications sent a chill through me despite the August heat. People don't abandon a hot meal and actively extinguish their fire unless something forces them to leave immediately. Fear, panic, threat. We spent the next hour searching the immediate area around the campsite for any signs of struggle or clues about what direction they might have gone. Deputy Torres set up our communications equipment while Susan Walsh and the Morrison twins began organizing our search supplies. The tracking dogs arrived with Deputy Williams, both animals eager to work but strangely agitated in ways their handler had never seen before. Buster keeps whining and circling back to the truck, Williams told me, scratching his head. And Sadie won't stop staring at those trees over there. He pointed toward the northern edge of the clearing, where the forest grew particularly dense. I've never seen them act like this. It's like they can smell something that's making them nervous. We gave the dogs articles of clothing from the tent, one of Vicente's shirts and a pair of Diego's socks. Both animals caught the scent immediately, their tails wagging as they put their noses to the ground. But instead of heading off in a clear direction like we expected, they began moving in seemingly random patterns around the campsite. Buster would pick up a trail heading east toward the creek, follow it for maybe 50 yards, then stop abruptly and whine. Sadie would find tracks going north into the heavy timber, but after 30 or 40 yards, she'd circle back with her ears flat against her head, a sure sign of canine confusion or fear. "I don't understand this," Williams muttered, watching his dog's unusual behavior. "It's like the scent trail starts and stops in random places. How does that happen? People don't just vanish into thin air and reappear somewhere else." Deputy Martinez was having similar problems with the physical evidence. "I found boot prints here," he called from near the creek bank. "Adult-sized, probably Vicente's. But they just stop at the water's edge, and I can't find any corresponding prints on the other side. Like he walked to the water and disappeared." 40 feet away, Hansen discovered something even more puzzling. "Got smaller prints over here, child-sized. They lead from the tent toward those big boulders, but then..." He gestured helplessly at a flat area of bare rock. "Nothing. The trail just ends." As the afternoon wore on, we discovered more of these incomplete trails scattered around the campsite and extending into the surrounding forest. Boot prints that appeared suddenly in soft earth with no indication of how they'd gotten there. Broken branches at adult height in areas where no footprints existed on the ground below. A child's candy bar wrapper stuck to a tree branch 8 feet off the ground, too high for 9-year-old Diego to have placed it there himself. The physical evidence was telling a story that made no logical sense, and the dog's behavior was becoming more erratic with each passing hour. Both animals would start following a trail with confidence, only to stop suddenly and bark at empty air, their hackles raised as if confronting an invisible threat. As the sun began its descent toward the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the campsite, I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Despite the strange evidence and the dog's nervous behavior, we had 2 people missing in wilderness that could kill them within days. Whether the clues made sense or not, we had to start searching. "We'll use a standard grid pattern," I announced to the team. "Martinez and Wilson take the eastern sector toward Copper Ridge. Torres and Hansen cover the southern approach to Deadwater Falls. The volunteers will work in pairs covering the western slopes." I looked at the northern tree line where the forest seemed to swallow light itself. "I'll take that sector with Deputy Williams and the dogs. Something up there has their attention, and I want to know what it is." As we prepared to head out, Old Pete approached me with a concerned expression. "Deputy Morrison," he said quietly, "I've been hunting and fishing these mountains for 40 years. I've never seen anything like what we found here today. You watch yourself out there. This doesn't feel right." The northern sector stretched before us like an open mouth, dark and uninviting, despite the afternoon sun still filtering through the canopy above. Deputy Williams and I moved carefully through the undergrowth, following Buster and Sadie as they worked the scent trails with increasing agitation. The deeper we went into the forest, the more unnatural everything felt. The silence was the first thing that struck me as wrong. In healthy forest, you should hear birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush. Here, there was nothing but the soft crunch of our boots on dead leaves and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. Even our own breathing seemed muffled, as if the trees themselves were absorbing sound. "Williams," I called softly, not wanting to speak too loudly in the oppressive quiet. "How long have you been working with these dogs?" "5 years," he replied, keeping pace beside me while watching his animals closely. "Never seen them act like this. Look at Sadie's ears. They're pinned back, but she's still following the scent. That's fear behavior mixed with working drive. Dogs don't usually show both at the same time." As if to emphasize his point, Buster suddenly stopped dead in his tracks about 20 yards ahead of us. The German Shepherd's entire body went rigid, his tail dropping low as he stared at something we couldn't see. A low whine escaped his throat, the kind of sound a dog makes when it's trying to warn you about danger it can't explain. We approached slowly, hands instinctively moving toward our weapons. Buster was fixated on a cluster of large Douglas firs, their trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle one. The ground between them was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, creating a soft, brown surface that should have held tracks clearly. "There," Williams whispered, pointing at the base of the largest tree. "Bootprints." The prints were unmistakably human, adult-sized boots with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel that matched the impressions we'd found back at the campsite. But these prints were different. They appeared suddenly in the middle of the soft needle bed, with no trail leading to them from any direction. It was as if Vicente had materialized at that spot, taken several steps in a small circle, then vanished again. More disturbing was the depth of the impressions. The prints were pressed deep into the soft earth, deeper than a normal walking gait would create. Someone had been standing there, shifting his weight back and forth with considerable force, pacing or struggling. Sadie had moved to a spot about 15 feet away, her nose pressed to the ground as she worked another scent trail. This one led to a small clearing where we found signs that made my blood pressure spike. Scuff marks in the dirt. Several broken branches at waist height, snapped cleanly as if someone had been pushed or dragged through them. And most chilling of all, a small piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush at exactly the height of a 9-year-old child. The fabric was blue denim, torn raggedly as if ripped away by force. Williams photographed it carefully before I removed it with tweezers, sealing it in an evidence bag. The material was still relatively fresh, not weathered by days of exposure to the elements. "Deputy Morrison," Williams said, his voice tight with concern. "Look at this pattern we're seeing. Random scent trails that appear and disappear. Signs of struggle in isolated spots with no connecting evidence. It's like these people were moved around the forest instead of walking through it." The implications of his observation made my stomach turn. "Moved by what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Or who?" he replied grimly. We spent the next 2 hours working deeper into the northern sector, following the dogs as they led us from one inexplicable scent pocket to another. The pattern continued. Evidence of human presence in scattered locations with no logical connections between them. A child's shoe print pressed into mud beside a small stream, but no corresponding prints approaching or leaving the area. Adult-sized handprints pressed into the bark of a tree at shoulder height, as if someone had been pushed against it with considerable force. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, the temperature began to drop noticeably. What had started as a warm August day was turning into something much cooler, and the air carried a dampness that seemed to seep through our clothing. The forest around us was changing too, becoming darker and more oppressive with each step we took away from the campsite. The trees grew larger and closer together the deeper we went, their branches interlocking overhead to form an almost solid canopy that blocked most of the remaining daylight. The undergrowth became thicker and more tangled, forcing us to push through walls of ferns and brambles that caught at our clothing and equipment. It was in one of these dense thickets that we made our most disturbing discovery. Sadie had been working a particularly strong scent trail when she suddenly stopped and began to bark. Not her normal working bark, but a high-pitched, frightened sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. She was focused on a large fallen log that had created a natural shelter in the undergrowth. Williams called her back and approached the log carefully, his flashlight beam dancing across the shadowy space beneath it. "God Almighty," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I joined him and immediately understood his reaction. Scratched into the soft earth beneath the log were desperate markings, words gouged into the dirt with a stick or finger. The letters were uneven and hard to read, clearly made by someone under extreme stress, but the message was unmistakable. "Help us." Below that, in smaller, more frantic letters, "They took Diego." The words hit me like a physical blow. Vicente had been here, recently enough that rain hadn't washed away his message. He'd been conscious, coherent, and desperate enough to leave this plea for help. But where was he now? And who had taken his grandson? Williams was photographing the scratched message when both dogs suddenly went into full alert mode. Their ears perked up, heads turning toward the north, deeper into the forest. A sound was drifting through the trees, faint but unmistakably human. Voices. Calling. "Diego!" The voice was distant but clear, filled with anguish and desperation. "Diego, where are you?" It was Vicente. He was alive, and he was somewhere in the forest ahead of us, still searching for his grandson. Williams and I looked at each other for a split second before we both started moving, crashing through the underbrush toward the sound of that desperate voice. "Vicente!" I shouted as we ran. "Vicente Gonzalez, this is the sheriff's department. We're here to help you." The calling stopped abruptly. The forest fell back into its unnatural silence, as if our voices had been swallowed by the trees themselves. We stopped running and listened intently, straining to hear any response, any indication of which direction the voice had come from. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind through the branches and the sound of our own labored breathing. "Vicente!" Williams called out, his voice echoing strangely in the dense timber. "We're search and rescue. Call out if you can hear us." Still nothing. It was as if the voice had never existed, as if the forest had played a cruel trick on our desperate ears. But both dogs were still alert, still focused on something ahead of us in the darkness between the trees. As the last rays of sunlight began to fade from the sky above the canopy, I made the decision to return to the campsite and regroup with the rest of the search team. Whatever was happening in these woods was beyond anything I'd encountered in 3 years of search and rescue work, and I wasn't about to risk losing more people in the darkness. The hike back to the campsite felt longer than it should have, as if the forest itself was trying to confuse our sense of direction. Twice, Williams had to consult his compass to make sure we were heading the right way, and both times we discovered we'd been veering off course without realizing it. By the time we emerged from the tree line into the clearing where Vicente's truck waited, full darkness had settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket. The other search teams had already returned and were gathered around a large campfire, their faces grim with the day's disappointing results. Nobody had found any trace of Diego. And now, with Vicente's desperate message burned into my memory, I knew we were dealing with something far worse than a simple case of people getting lost in the woods. The debriefing around the campfire revealed a pattern that chilled me more than the mountain air. Every search team had encountered the same inexplicable evidence, scent trails that appeared and disappeared without logical connection, signs of human presence in impossible locations, and an overwhelming sense that something in the forest was actively working against our efforts. Deputy Martinez reported finding Diego's other shoe wedged in the fork of a tree branch 12 feet off the ground, with no indication of how it had gotten there. The Morrison twins had discovered adult-sized footprints pressed into soft mud at the bottom of a steep ravine, but no corresponding prints on either side showing how someone could have reached that spot without rappelling equipment. Most disturbing was Susan Walsh's report from the western sector. Her team had found a section of disturbed earth near Copper Creek, where the ground showed clear signs of a struggle: torn vegetation, scuffed dirt, broken branches. but when they tried to follow any trails leading away from the scene, they found nothing. The evidence of conflict simply existed in isolation, surrounded by undisturbed forest. "It doesn't make sense," Martinez said, poking at the fire with a stick. "People don't just teleport around the wilderness. There has to be a logical explanation for what we're seeing." Old Pete, who had been listening quietly from the edge of the group, finally spoke up. "I've seen animals moved like this," he said slowly. "When predators cache their prey, drag it to one location, then another, storing it for later consumption." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Deputy Torres was the first to break it. "You're talking about bears," he said, his voice hopeful. "Black bears will move carcasses to different locations." "Bears don't scratch messages in the dirt asking for help," I replied grimly. "And they don't take children's shoes and hang them in trees." Williams nodded in agreement. "Besides, the dogs would react differently to bear scent. What we're seeing is something else entirely." As we continued to discuss the day's findings, I noticed that the forest around our campsite had begun to feel different. The oppressive silence I'd noticed during the day had been replaced by something that might have been worse: the sense that we were being watched. Every time I looked up from the fire toward the tree line, I expected to see eyes reflecting our firelight from the darkness. The dogs felt it too. Buster and Sadie, who should have been resting after a hard day's work, remained alert and on edge. They positioned themselves between our group and the northern tree line, occasionally letting out low growls at sounds or movements that we couldn't detect. "We need to establish a watch rotation," I announced. "2 people awake at all times, keeping the fire burning and the dogs close. Something about this situation doesn't feel right, and I don't want to take any chances." Deputy Hanson, eager to prove himself, volunteered for the first watch along with old Pete. The rest of us settled into our sleeping bags arranged in a rough circle around the fire, weapons within easy reach. Despite the exhaustion from a full day of hiking and searching, I found myself staring up at the stars visible through breaks in the canopy. The night sounds of the forest seemed muted and wrong. Instead of the normal chorus of owls, nightbirds, and small animals that should have filled the darkness, we heard only the occasional crack of a branch in the distance and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. Even the creek's gurgling seemed subdued, as if it were trying not to draw attention to itself. I must have dozed off despite my intentions to stay alert, because the next thing I knew, Deputy Hanson was shaking my shoulder urgently. "Deputy Morrison," he whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "You need to see this." I sat up immediately, automatically reaching for my service weapon as I scanned the campsite. The fire was still burning brightly, casting dancing shadows across our sleeping area. Old Pete was standing near the northern edge of the clearing, his hunting rifle cradled in his arms as he stared intently into the darkness between the trees. "What's the situation?" I asked quietly, not wanting to wake the others unnecessarily. "About 20 minutes ago, we started hearing sounds from the woods," Hanson explained, his words coming in rushed whispers. "Not animal sounds, human sounds, like someone moving through the brush, trying to be quiet but not succeeding." Old Pete joined us, never taking his eyes off the tree line. "Started with just rustling leaves and snapping twigs," he said. "Normal sounds, except they were too regular, too purposeful, like someone walking in circles around our camp, staying just far enough back that we couldn't see them." "Then came the whistling," Hanson added, and something in his voice made my skin crawl. "Whistling?" I asked, though I had a terrible suspicion about what he was going to tell me. "Wolf whistles," old Pete confirmed. 3 of them, spaced maybe 5 minutes apart, coming from different directions each time. First from the north, then east, then south, like whoever's out there is moving around us. The implications hit me immediately. Wolf whistles weren't a natural sound. They were distinctly human, the kind of catcall whistle men might make at an attractive woman. There was no innocent explanation for hearing them in the middle of wilderness at 2 in the morning. Did you try calling out? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Called out each time, Hansen replied. Identified ourselves as law enforcement, asked if anyone needed help. No response. The sounds just stopped for a few minutes, then started up again from a different location. As if summoned by our conversation, a clear wolf whistle drifted out of the darkness from somewhere beyond the eastern edge of our campsite. The sound was unmistakably human, unmistakably deliberate, and unmistakably threatening in its context. This wasn't someone lost and trying to attract our attention. This was someone playing games with us. I was on my feet immediately, flashlight in one hand and weapon in the other. Hello, I called out toward the source of the sound. This is Deputy Morrison with the County Sheriff's Office. Identify yourself. The only response was another wolf whistle, this one from the complete opposite direction, somewhere in the trees behind our campsite. Whoever was out there had moved at least 100 yards in the few seconds since the first whistle. Either we were dealing with multiple people, or someone with an intimate knowledge of the terrain who could move through the forest in complete darkness without making noise. Williams was awake now, both dogs pressed against his legs and growling low in their throats. Martinez and Wilson were sitting up in their sleeping bags, hands on their weapons as they scanned the darkness around us. Torres was already reaching for his radio equipment. Torres, can you raise dispatch? I asked quietly. He tried for several minutes, adjusting frequencies and antenna positions, but got nothing but static. Something's interfering with the signal, he reported. Could be the terrain or atmospheric conditions or... He paused, unwilling to voice the darker possibility that someone might be jamming our communications deliberately. A third wolf whistle came from the north, the same direction where Williams and I had found Vicente's desperate message scratched in the dirt. This time, the sound seemed closer, as if whoever was making it was growing bolder, tightening their circle around our campsite. That's enough, I said, making a decision that I hoped wouldn't get anyone killed. Martinez, Wilson, you're with me. We're going to find out who's playing games in our investigation. Deputy Morrison, old Pete said quietly. Maybe that's exactly what they want us to do. Split up, leave the campsite undefended. His words gave me pause. The tactical situation was everything law enforcement training warns against. Unknown number of suspects, unfamiliar terrain, limited visibility, compromised communications. But 2 people were still missing in this forest, and someone was actively taunting the search and rescue team sent to find them. Another whistle, closer still, made the decision for me. We stick together, I announced. Everyone up, gear on, weapons ready. We're going to investigate as a group, keeping the campfire between us and the tree line. As we prepared to move out, both tracking dogs began exhibiting behavior I'd never seen before. Instead of focusing on the direction of the whistles like trained tracking animals should, they kept circling back to Vicente's truck, whining and pawing at the vehicle as if trying to tell us something. What's wrong with them? Williams muttered, attempting to get Buster to focus on the scent trails we'd established earlier. I walked over to the truck and examined it more carefully with my flashlight. The vehicle looked exactly as it had when we'd arrived. Locked, undisturbed, covered with a light layer of dust from the dirt road. But as I played my light across the truck bed, something caught my attention. There, pressed into the thin layer of dust on the tailgate, were handprints. Small handprints, exactly the size a 9-year-old boy would make. They weren't there when we'd arrived that morning. I was certain of it, because I'd examined the truck thoroughly as part of our initial investigation. Someone had been at Vicente's truck while we were sleeping. Someone small enough to be Diego himself, or someone who wanted us to think Diego had been there. The wolf whistles started up again, but this time they came in rapid succession from multiple directions, creating an eerie chorus that seemed to surround our campsite entirely. The sound echoed off the trees and rocks, making it impossible to pinpoint exact locations, but one thing was clear: we were outnumbered. As the last whistle faded into the night, a new sound replaced it. Somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight, someone was calling out in a voice filled with terror and desperation. "Help me, please, somebody help me." It was Diego's voice. The sound of Diego's terrified plea cut through the night air like a knife, galvanizing our entire team into immediate action. Williams released both dogs, and they bounded toward the northern tree line where the voice had originated, their powerful forms disappearing into the shadows beyond our firelight. "Diego!" I shouted, following the dogs into the darkness. "Diego, we're here! Keep calling so we can find you!" Behind me, I could hear the rest of the team crashing through the underbrush, flashlight beams dancing wildly as we pursued the sound of that desperate young voice. The forest seemed to swallow our lights, the thick canopy overhead blocking out even the faintest starlight, leaving us in a maze of shadows and tree trunks. "Over here!" Diego's voice called again, but now it seemed to be coming from a completely different direction, somewhere off to our left. We changed course, stumbling over fallen logs and pushing through brambles that tore at our clothing and equipment. Williams was ahead of us, following his dog's frantic barking, when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. "Morrison!" he called back, his voice filled with confusion and growing alarm. "The dogs are circling. They can't lock onto a specific direction." I reached his position and saw what he meant. Buster and Sadie were running in tight circles around a small clearing, whining and barking at empty air. Their behavior was completely contrary to their training. Tracking dogs should follow a scent trail in a straight line toward their target, not run in confused circles. "Please!" Diego's voice came again, closer now but still impossible to pinpoint. "I can't find Grandpa. Someone took him. They're coming back for me." The raw terror in that young voice drove us deeper into the forest, following what seemed like a deliberate path through the trees. But as we pursued the sound, a horrible realization began to dawn on me. Each time Diego called out, his voice came from a different location, but the distance seemed to remain constant. It was as if the source of the voice was moving parallel to us, staying just far enough ahead to remain out of sight. "Diego!" Martinez called out. "Stay where you are! Don't move! We're coming to get you!" "I can't," came the reply, now from somewhere behind us. "They won't let me! They keep moving me!" That response stopped me cold. I held up my hand, signaling the team to halt, and we all stood in the darkness listening intently. For a moment, the forest was completely silent except for the sound of our own heavy breathing and the dogs' continued whining. Then Diego's voice came again, but this time there was something wrong with it. The words were the same. "Help me! Please, somebody help me!" But the tone was slightly off. Too measured, too clear for a 9-year-old boy who had been lost in the wilderness for days. Williams heard it too. "That's a recording," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's playing a recording of the kid's voice." The implications of his realization hit all of us simultaneously. We'd been led deep into the forest, away from our defensible campsite, chasing the sound of a recording. We'd been manipulated, drawn into exactly the kind of tactical situation that gets law enforcement officers killed. "Back to camp," I ordered immediately. "Now, stay together. Weapons ready." As we turned to retrace our steps, Diego's voice started up again, but this time it was coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The same terrified plea, "Help me! Please, somebody help me!" was being broadcast from different locations around us, creating a disorienting echo effect that made it impossible to determine which direction was which. The dogs were going crazy, running from one voice to another, unable to understand why their noses couldn't locate the source of the sounds they were hearing. Williams called them back, clipping leashes to their collars to keep them close as we tried to navigate back to our campsite. But finding our way back proved more difficult than it should have been. The forest in darkness looked completely different from the route we'd taken following the recording. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks seemed to have moved, and paths that we'd clearly marked with broken branches appeared to have vanished entirely. "Which way?" Hansen asked, playing his flashlight beam in all directions. "Everything looks the same." Torres consulted his compass, but the needle was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Compass is malfunctioning," he reported. "Must be mineral deposits in the area affecting the magnetism." The recording of Diego's voice continued to play around us, sometimes close enough that it seemed like the boy should be visible in our flashlight beams, other times distant enough to be barely audible. The pattern was clearly designed to confuse and disorient us, and it was working. Old Pete, whose lifetime of experience in these mountains should have made him our most reliable guide, was having as much trouble as the rest of us. "I don't understand it," he muttered, studying the terrain with his flashlight. "This area should be familiar to me, but nothing looks right." As we continued searching for the path back to camp, the forest around us began to feel increasingly hostile. The recorded pleas for help took on a mocking quality, as if whoever was controlling them was enjoying our confusion. Worse, other sounds began to join the chorus, adult voices calling out in Spanish, obviously Vicente pleading for his grandson's safety. "Diego, where are you?" The man's voice was filled with anguish, clearly authentic recordings of Vicente's desperate search for his missing grandson. "Please, I need my medicine. I can't keep going much longer." The psychological warfare was effective. Every instinct we had as law enforcement officers and human beings was to respond to those cries for help, even knowing they were recordings. The emotional manipulation was designed to cloud our judgment and keep us moving in circles through the dark forest. Martinez was the first to spot the orange glow filtering through the trees ahead of us. "There," he said, pointing toward what had to be our campfire. "Camp's that way." We moved toward the light as quickly as the terrain would allow, eager to get back to our defensive position and regroup. But as we got closer, something seemed wrong with the scene ahead of us. The glow was too bright, too large for the campfire we'd left burning. When we finally pushed through the last line of trees into the clearing, we found our worst fears confirmed. Our campsite was in flames. Not just the fire pit, but Vicente's truck, our tents, our supplies, everything we'd left behind was burning with an intensity that suggested accelerant had been used. The heat was overwhelming, forcing us to stay back at the tree line as we watched our equipment and evidence go up in smoke. The truck's gas tank exploded as we stood there, sending a mushroom of flame and black smoke high into the night sky. "Our radios," Torres said numbly, watching the communications equipment melt in the inferno. "Our food, our medical supplies, everything." Williams was staring at the destruction with a different kind of horror. "The evidence," he said. "All the photographs, the samples we collected, Vicente's message scratched in the dirt. It's all gone." The burning campsite illuminated the forest around us in a hellish orange glow, and in that flickering light, I finally saw them. Silhouettes moving between the trees on the far side of the clearing, barely visible through the smoke and flames. At least 6 figures standing motionless as they watched our equipment burn. They were too far away to make out details, but their stillness was somehow more threatening than if they'd been advancing toward us. They simply stood there in the shadows, observing our situation with what seemed like satisfaction. "There," I said quietly, pointing toward the figures. 6 o'clock, just inside the tree line." The rest of the team followed my gaze, and weapons were drawn immediately. But even as we prepared to confront whoever had destroyed our camp, the figures began to fade back into the forest, disappearing one by one until there was nothing left but dancing shadows cast by the flames. "Spread out," I ordered. "Perimeter formation. These people have been playing games with us all night, and now they've just escalated to arson and destruction of evidence. No one moves alone. If you see anything at all, you call it out immediately." As we took defensive positions around the burning campsite, the recorded voices of Diego and Vicente finally fell silent. The forest returned to its unnatural quiet, broken only by the crackling of flames and the occasional pop of something exploding in the fire. We were stranded now, miles from the nearest road, without transportation or communication equipment, facing an unknown number of adversaries who had demonstrated both tactical planning and complete willingness to escalate the situation. Dawn was still hours away, and we had no way to call for backup. The hunt for 2 missing people had become something far more dangerous. We were no longer the hunters. We had become the prey. The flames from our destroyed campsite finally began to die down as the first pale hints of dawn crept over the eastern ridgeline. Vicente's truck was nothing but a twisted metal skeleton, still radiating heat that kept us at a distance. Our equipment, our supplies, our evidence, all reduced to ash and melted plastic. As the growing daylight allowed us to survey the full extent of the destruction, the tactical reality of our situation became clear. We were approximately 15 miles from the nearest logging road, without transportation, without communication equipment, and without the medical supplies that could keep us alive if anyone was seriously injured. Williams was examining what remained of our supply cache when he made a discovery that sent ice through my veins. "Morrison," he called softly. "You need to see this." In the soft earth near where our medical kit had been stored, pressed clearly into the dirt, was a perfect boot print. Adult-sized, with the distinctive wear pattern on the left heel that we'd been tracking for the past 2 days. Vicente's boot print. But this print was fresh, made after the fire had been set, while the ground was still soft from the heat and moisture. Which meant Vicente had been here, at our campsite, while we were chasing recordings of his grandson's voice through the forest. "That's impossible," Martinez said, studying the print. "We've been searching for this guy for 2 days. Why would he be here, at our camp, instead of trying to signal for help?" Old Pete knelt beside the print, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading sign in the wilderness. "This wasn't made by someone walking normally," he said quietly. "Look at the depth, the way the heel dug in. This is the print of someone who was struggling, being dragged or carried." The implications were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly disturbing. Vicente hadn't destroyed our campsite. He'd been brought here, possibly unconscious, possibly as a witness to the destruction of our rescue operation. Deputy Torres was working frantically with the remains of our radio equipment, trying to salvage anything that might allow us to communicate with the outside world. "It's no use," he finally announced. "Everything's melted beyond repair. We're completely cut off." As full daylight settled over the burned clearing, I made the decision that had been forming in my mind throughout the long night. "We're hiking out," I announced. "All of us together, following the logging road back to civilization. We'll send backup to continue the search once we've reported what happened here." "What about Vicente and Diego?" Hansen asked. "We can't just abandon them." "We're not abandoning them," I replied grimly. "But we're also not going to add 6 more missing persons to this situation. Whatever's happening in this forest is beyond the scope of a standard search and rescue operation." Williams was securing his dogs for the long hike when Buster suddenly went rigid. His attention focused on the northern tree line where we'd found so much strange evidence the day before. Both animals were exhibiting the same alert behavior they'd shown throughout our search, but now their focus seemed more specific, more urgent. "They've got something," Williams said, following his dog's gaze toward the forest. "Something definite this time." I followed his line of sight and felt my blood freeze. There, just barely visible in the shadows between the trees, stood 2 figures. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking what we were seeing, an adult and a child watching us from the edge of the forest. "Vicente!" I called out, starting toward the tree line. "Diego, we're here to help you!" But as I moved closer, the figures became clearer. and what I saw defied everything I thought I understood about the situation. The adult figure was definitely male, approximately Vicente's height and build, but something about his posture was wrong. He stood perfectly still, unnaturally rigid, like a scarecrow propped up among the trees. The smaller figure beside him was equally motionless, equally unnatural in its stillness. No 9-year-old boy could stand that still for that long, especially after being lost in the wilderness for days. "Something's not right," Martinez said, joining me as we approached the tree line. "They're not moving. They're not responding to our calls." When we got within 50 yards of the figures, the truth became horrifyingly apparent. What we were looking at weren't Vicente and Diego at all. They were mannequins, crude but effective representations dressed in clothing that matched the descriptions we'd been given of the missing campers. The adult mannequin wore a red flannel shirt and blue jeans, exactly what Mrs. Gonzalez had told us Vicente was wearing when he left Arizona. The child-sized figure was dressed in a yellow t-shirt and khaki shorts, Diego's last known outfit. But the clothing wasn't new. It was dirty, torn, stained with substances I didn't want to identify. This clothing had been worn by real people probably recently, before being stripped and used to dress these grotesque decoys. "This is sick," Wilson said, his voice filled with disgust and growing anger. "Someone's playing games with us, using those people's clothes to create fake victims." Williams was examining the mannequins more closely when he made another disturbing discovery. "There are speakers," he announced, pointing to small electronic devices hidden in the clothing. That's how they were broadcasting the voices. Someone's been controlling this whole operation remotely. The technical sophistication of what we were seeing was far beyond anything I'd encountered in rural law enforcement. Whoever was behind this had planned extensively, invested significant resources, and demonstrated a level of tactical awareness that suggested military or law enforcement training. "We need to get out of here now," I said, the full implications of our situation finally hitting me. This wasn't a random encounter with lost campers. This was a deliberate setup, and we've been the targets from the beginning. As we turned to leave the mannequins and begin our hike back to civilization, a new sound drifted through the forest. Not the recorded voices we'd been hearing all night, but something far worse. The sound of real humans screaming, filled with genuine terror and pain. The screams were coming from deeper in the forest, beyond where we'd searched, beyond where any lost camper should have been able to survive for 4 days without food, water, or medical attention. They were the sounds of people in immediate, life-threatening danger. Every instinct I had as a law enforcement officer demanded that we respond to those screams, investigate their source, attempt to help whoever was in distress. But my training and experience told me that responding would be exactly what whoever had orchestrated this situation wanted us to do. The screaming continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving the forest in its familiar, oppressive silence. In that silence, I made the hardest decision of my law enforcement career. "We're leaving," I announced firmly. "Whatever's happening here is bigger than a search and rescue operation. We need backup, proper equipment, and a tactical plan before we go any deeper into this situation." As we began our long hike back toward the logging road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. Somewhere in that forest, Vicente and Diego might still be alive, might still be in desperate need of rescue. But leading my team deeper into what was obviously a carefully planned trap wouldn't save anyone. The forest watched us leave in silence, holding its secrets close. But I knew we'd be back. And next time we'd be properly prepared for whatever was waiting in those dark woods. The hunt was far from over. It was just beginning. The 15-mile hike back to the main logging road took us nearly 8 hours, every step of it through terrain that seemed actively hostile to our presence. The dogs remained agitated throughout the journey, constantly looking back toward the forest we were leaving behind, whining softly as if they could sense something following us that we couldn't detect. The path that should have been familiar became increasingly confusing as we walked. Landmarks we'd noted on our way in seemed to have shifted or disappeared entirely. Creek crossings appeared where none should have existed, forcing us to make time-consuming detours through rough terrain. Trail markers that the Forestry Service had installed decades ago were missing or had been deliberately altered to point in wrong directions. Old Pete, whose knowledge of these mountains should have made him our most reliable guide, was becoming increasingly disturbed by what he was seeing. "This isn't right," he muttered for the dozenth time, studying a trail junction that shouldn't have existed according to our topographical maps. "I've hunted these ridges for 40 years, and this terrain doesn't match what I know." Deputy Torres was having similar problems with his compass and GPS equipment. The compass needle continued to spin wildly, unable to find magnetic north, while his GPS unit displayed error messages or showed our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "It's like someone's jamming our navigation equipment," he reported. "Electronic warfare stuff, military grade, way beyond anything civilian hunters or even criminals should have access to." The implications of sophisticated electronic countermeasures being deployed against our search and rescue operation added another layer of dread to our situation. We weren't dealing with random criminals or survivalist nuts hiding in the wilderness. This was organized, well-funded, and technologically advanced. Around midday, when we stopped to rest and assess our remaining water supplies, Deputy Martinez made an observation that crystallized my growing fears about what we'd encountered. "You know what bothers me most about this whole situation," he said, taking a careful sip from his water bottle. "The timing." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Think about it," he continued. "Mrs. Gonzalez calls Tuesday morning to report her husband and grandson missing. We organize a search team and get to their campsite by noon the same day. But whoever did this to our camp, whoever set up those mannequins and the recording equipment, that stuff takes time to prepare. Days, maybe weeks." His words sent a chill through me as I realized what he was suggesting. "You think they knew we were coming?" "I think they've been planning this whole operation around us specifically," Martinez replied grimly. "The question is why? What do they want with a bunch of search and rescue volunteers from a small county sheriff's office?" Deputy Wilson, who had been quietly listening to our conversation, offered a theory that made my stomach turn. What if Vicente and Diego were never really missing? What if they were taken specifically to lure search and rescue teams into the area? The possibility that we'd walked into a deliberate trap designed to target law enforcement personnel added a whole new dimension of horror to our situation. If Wilson was right, then everything we'd experienced, the strange evidence, the recorded voices, the destruction of our camp, had been carefully orchestrated to isolate and neutralize our team. As we continued our trek toward civilization, the forest around us began to change in subtle but disturbing ways. The trees seemed to grow larger and more twisted as we walked, their branches reaching toward each other overhead to form an increasingly dense canopy that blocked out most of the daylight. The undergrowth became thicker and more difficult to navigate, forcing us to slow our pace and expend precious energy, pushing through walls of brambles and fallen logs. Most disturbing was the complete absence of wildlife. In healthy forest, even a large group of people should encounter birds, squirrels, deer, and other animals going about their daily routines. Here we saw nothing. No movement, no sounds, no signs that anything lived in these woods except the trees themselves. "It's like everything's been scared away," Williams observed, watching his dog's continued nervous behavior. "Buster and Sadie are trained to work in all kinds of environments, but they've been on edge since we entered this area yesterday. Whatever's in these woods has got every living thing running scared." As afternoon wore on, our water supplies began to run dangerously low. The creek crossings we encountered were either completely dry or flowing with water that looked and smelled contaminated. Old Pete, whose wilderness survival skills were legendary in our county, refused to let anyone drink from the questionable water sources. "Something's wrong with the water," he explained, examining a stream that should have been crystal clear mountain runoff. It's got an oily film on the surface, and it smells like chemicals, like someone's been dumping industrial waste upstream. The possibility of environmental contamination added another layer of concern to our situation. If the water sources in the area had been deliberately poisoned, it would explain the absence of wildlife and could pose a serious health threat to anyone stranded in the forest for extended periods. By late afternoon, when we finally reached the main logging road, we were exhausted, dehydrated, and deeply shaken by what we'd experienced. The sight of that dirt road stretching away through normal, healthy-looking forest was more welcome than any of us wanted to admit. Deputy Torres immediately began attempting to raise dispatch on his portable radio, now that we were out of the strange electromagnetic interference that had plagued our communications in the forest. After several tries, he finally made contact with our home station. "Dispatch, this is Torres with Search and Rescue Team Alpha," he said into the radio. "We have an emergency situation. Request immediate backup and tactical support at Deadwater Creek Campground." The response from dispatch was immediate and alarming. "Torres, where the hell have you been?" came the voice of our dispatcher, Mrs. Chen. "We've been trying to reach your team for 2 days. State Police, FBI, and National Guard units have been mobilized for a multi-agency search operation." 2 days. We'd been in the forest for less than 24 hours, but according to dispatch, we'd been missing for 2 full days. The time distortion was impossible, but undeniable given the radio timestamp and the level of alarm in Mrs. Chen's voice. "Negative dispatch," Torres replied, confusion evident in his voice. "We entered the search area yesterday at noon and are returning now, approximately 1800 hours the following day." "Torres, it's Thursday evening." Mrs. Chen's voice crackled through the radio. "You've been missing since Tuesday. Your families are frantic, and every law enforcement agency in 3 states is looking for you." The impossible time discrepancy added one final layer of horror to our experience. Somehow, we'd lost an entire day in that forest, with no memory of the missing time and no explanation for how such a thing could happen. As we waited for the convoy of backup vehicles that dispatch was sending to our location, I tried to process everything we'd encountered. The strange evidence patterns, the electronic countermeasures, the sophisticated psychological warfare, the missing time. None of it fit the profile of any criminal organization I'd encountered in my law enforcement career. Old Pete summed up what we were all thinking as we sat on the logging road, watching the sun set over the forest we'd barely escaped. "Whatever's in those woods," he said quietly, "it ain't human." The convoy of state police, FBI agents, and National Guard vehicles that arrived to extract us from the logging road was the largest law enforcement response our county had ever seen. The fact that 6 law enforcement officers and civilian volunteers had gone missing during a routine search and rescue operation had triggered protocols normally reserved for terrorist attacks or officer-down situations. Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Seattle field office took charge of the scene immediately, establishing a command post and beginning the systematic debriefing that would consume the next 72 hours. Her questions were precise, professional, and increasingly skeptical as our account of events became more difficult to believe. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Agent Chen said, reviewing her notes for the 3rd time. "You're telling me that during your search for 2 missing campers, you encountered sophisticated electronic countermeasures, coordinated psychological warfare, and lost an entire day that you have no memory of." I knew how it sounded. In the harsh fluorescent lights of the FBI's mobile command unit, surrounded by maps and communications equipment, our experience in the forest seemed impossible even to us. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Vicente's truck had been found exactly where we described it, burned down to the metal frame. The mannequins we discovered were recovered and sent to the FBI crime lab for analysis. The electronic devices used to broadcast the recorded voices were seized as evidence. Most importantly, the satellite tracking data from our radio equipment showed that we had indeed been in the forest for only 24 hours, despite the fact that we'd been reported missing for 3 days. "The time discrepancy is confirmed," Agent Chen continued, reading from a technical report. According to GPS data from your radio equipment, your team entered the forest at 12:47 p.m. on Tuesday and emerged at 6:23 p.m. on Wednesday. 29 hours and 36 minutes total. But according to every other record we have, dispatch logs, family statements, search coordination efforts, you were missing from Tuesday afternoon until Thursday evening. The FBI's technical analysis team had found no explanation for the missing time. Satellite imagery showed nothing unusual in the forest area during the period in question. Weather records were normal. There were no reports of unusual electromagnetic phenomena or military exercises that could account for what we'd experienced. What troubled Agent Chen most was the complete absence of Vicente and Diego Gonzalez. Despite an intensive search involving hundreds of law enforcement personnel, tracking dogs, helicopters, and ground-penetrating radar, no trace of the missing campers had been found. It was as if they had never existed. We contacted Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez in Phoenix. Agent Chen informed me during one of our private debriefing sessions. There's no record of her having a husband named Vicente or a grandson named Diego. No one by those names lives at the address she gave you. The phone number she called from is registered to a prepaid cellular service that was purchased with cash and can't be traced. The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. The missing persons case that had started our entire ordeal had been fabricated. Someone had deliberately lured our search and rescue team into that forest, using false information about people who didn't exist. But we found their campsite, I protested. Their truck, their equipment, evidence of their presence. The truck was stolen from a Phoenix airport parking lot 3 weeks ago, Agent Chen replied. The camping equipment was purchased with cash from sporting goods stores throughout Arizona and New Mexico. Someone went to considerable expense and effort to create the appearance of missing campers. The FBI's investigation eventually expanded to include specialists in domestic terrorism, organized crime, and what Agent Chen euphemistically referred to as unusual phenomena. None of their experts could provide a satisfactory explanation for what our team had experienced. The mannequins dressed in Vicente and Diego's clothing remained the most disturbing piece of physical evidence. Laboratory analysis revealed that the clothing had indeed been worn by real people. DNA evidence confirmed the presence of biological material from 2 individuals, one adult male and one juvenile male. But there were no matches in any database, and the chemical composition of some of the stains suggested exposure to substances that didn't exist in any known industrial or military inventory. The speakers hidden in the mannequins were broadcasting equipment that's at least 20 years ahead of anything currently available to civilian or military organizations, Agent Chen explained. The power source was some kind of micro-reactor that our nuclear specialists have never seen before. The electronic countermeasures that disabled your navigation equipment required technology that's theoretically possible but not practically achievable with current engineering. As the weeks passed, the FBI's investigation gradually wound down without reaching any conclusions. Agent Chen was reassigned to other cases. The physical evidence was archived in federal storage facilities. The official report classified our experience as unexplained phenomena requiring no further investigation at this time. But for those of us who had been in that forest, the case never ended. Deputy Martinez transferred to a different county within 6 months, unable to sleep through the night without dreaming about wolf whistles in the darkness. Deputy Wilson left law enforcement entirely, moving to Florida, where he now works as a fishing guide and refuses to discuss what happened in the mountains. Old Pete died the following winter, officially of a heart attack, but his family claimed he'd been acting strangely since our return from the forest, often talking about sounds in the woods that no one else could hear. Williams and his tracking dogs were never quite the same either. Buster and Sadie, once considered the best search and rescue team in the state, became increasingly unreliable after our experience. They would refuse to enter certain areas of wilderness, cowering and whining when asked to work in dense forest conditions, similar to what we'd encountered at Deadwater Creek. As for me, I remained with the sheriff's department for another 5 years, but never participated in another search and rescue operation. Every time a missing persons call came in involving wilderness areas, I would remember the sound of Diego's recorded voice calling for help in the darkness, and I would find excuses to send other deputies instead. I've spent 35 years since that August in 1987 trying to understand what happened to us in those mountains. I've read every book on unexplained phenomena, corresponded with researchers who study similar cases, and interviewed dozens of other law enforcement officers who've encountered situations that defy conventional explanation. What I've learned is that we weren't the first search and rescue team to disappear into the Northwest wilderness and return with impossible stories. There have been dozens of similar cases over the decades, all involving the same basic pattern: missing persons reports that turn out to be fabricated, search teams that encounter sophisticated countermeasures and psychological warfare, physical evidence that suggests technology beyond current human capabilities. The files on these cases are scattered across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, often classified or buried in bureaucratic archives, where they'll never be reviewed by anyone with the authority to connect the patterns. But the patterns are there, for anyone willing to look. My nephew, who asked me to tell this story, is now a deputy himself in a different state. He's never had to respond to a search and rescue call in dense wilderness, and I pray to God he never will. Because somewhere in those dark forests, something is still hunting, still setting traps, still collecting law enforcement personnel for purposes I don't want to imagine. Mrs. Gonzalez, whoever she really was, made one phone call that destroyed the lives of everyone on our search team. Vicente and Diego, whether they were real people or elaborate fictions, served their purpose as bait to lure us into that forest. And somewhere in those mountains, in forests that look normal and peaceful on satellite images and topographical maps, the hunt continues, waiting for the next search and rescue team brave enough or foolish enough to answer the call for help. I retired from law enforcement in 1992, exactly 5 years after our encounter at Deadwater Creek. I moved to a small town in the desert Southwest, as far from dense forests as I could get while staying in the continental United States. I've never been camping since that August in 1987, and I never will again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still and the desert is silent, I hear them. Faint and distant, carried on air currents that shouldn't exist, the sounds of wolf whistles and a young boy's voice calling for help. They're still out there, still hunting, still waiting for the next team of rescuers to answer their call. The case file on the Deadwater Creek incident remains open in the FBI's archives, stamped with classifications that ensure it will never be fully investigated or publicly disclosed. Agent Chen, who supervised the initial investigation, died in a car accident 2 years later, under circumstances that her family still questions. And in the mountains of the Northwest, the forests grow darker and more impenetrable with each passing year, holding their secrets close while they wait for new prey to stumble into their trap. The hunt that began in August 1987 never ended. It just moved to different forests, different states, different search and rescue teams whose members are now experiencing the same impossible encounters that destroyed our lives. If you're reading this account and you work in search and rescue, wilderness law enforcement, or any related field, please remember our story. Question missing persons reports that seem too convenient, too perfectly designed to draw you into remote wilderness areas. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong about a search location, and never ever go into the deep forests alone, because somewhere in those dark woods, something is still hunting. And it's very, very patient. This account was compiled from interviews with the surviving members of Search and Rescue Team Alpha, FBI case files obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, and personal documents provided by the families of the deceased team members. The names of some individuals have been changed to protect their privacy and ensure their continued safety. The Deadwater Creek incident remains an open case in federal law enforcement databases. Anyone with information regarding similar encounters is encouraged to contact the FBI's Unusual Phenomena Investigation Unit through official channels. The wilderness areas mentioned in this account remain accessible to the public, though local authorities strongly recommend that civilian hikers and campers travel in large groups and maintain regular contact with park ranger stations when venturing into remote forest locations. The Navajo National Forest wasn't on any tourist maps. That's precisely why I'd chosen it for our annual hiking trip. After 5 years of increasingly crowded trails in national parks, I wanted something remote, untouched, somewhere I could disappear for a week and truly disconnect. My two longtime friends, Mike and Jason, had reluctantly agreed. They trusted my wilderness experience, even if they privately questioned the wisdom of venturing so far from civilization. We'd met in college 10 years ago, bonding over weekend backpacking trips. Now in our mid-30s, these annual excursions were our escape from corporate jobs and mounting responsibilities. "You sure we're still on BLM land?" Mike asked, adjusting his pack as we paused at a ridge overlooking miles of dense pine forest. His breath clouded in the early October air. "According to the GPS, we're about 2 miles from the reservation boundary," I replied, checking my handheld unit. "We'll make camp well before we reach it." Jason took a long drink from his water bottle. "Remind me why we couldn't just go to Yosemite like normal people?" I smiled, but didn't answer. How could I explain the growing sense of suffocation I'd felt lately? The need to push beyond the comfortable and familiar? These woods called to me in a way I couldn't articulate. We continued our descent into the valley, following a faint game trail. The forest grew denser, old-growth pines towering above us, their canopy filtering the afternoon sunlight into hazy beams. The silence was absolute. No distant highway noise, no passing airplanes, just the occasional rustle of wind through branches and our boots on the needle-covered ground. "No cell service," Mike noted, checking his phone before tucking it away. "That's the point," I replied. "Complete digital detox." By late afternoon, we'd found an ideal camping spot near a small stream. We worked efficiently, setting up our tents in a small clearing and gathering firewood before darkness fell. Years of friendship had turned us into a well-oiled machine when it came to wilderness camping. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I noticed Mike staring intently at something across the clearing. "What is it?" I asked, following his gaze. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "Thought I saw something move over there, but it was probably just a deer." We settled around the campfire as night descended, cooking freeze-dried meals and sharing a flask of whiskey. The stars emerged above the gaps in the canopy, brilliant and countless in the true darkness, only found in places far from human habitation. "You know this area is steeped in Navajo folklore," Jason said, warming his hands by the fire. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about these forests." I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know your grandfather was Navajo." "He wasn't. He worked on the reservation as a doctor in the 70s. Picked up a lot of stories during his time there." Jason lowered his voice dramatically. "He said these woods were considered dangerous, not just because of the rugged terrain, but because of what might live here." Mike groaned. "Please tell me you're not about to launch into a ghost story." "Not ghosts," Jason continued. "The old-timers talked about skinwalkers, medicine men who'd gone bad, who could transform themselves into animals. They were said to stalk anyone who ventured too far into their territory." "That's just stories to keep people from trespassing on sacred land," I said dismissively, though something about Jason's words sent a ripple of unease through me. "Maybe," Jason shrugged. "But my grandfather said the Navajo Rangers wouldn't go into certain parts of these forests alone, even in daylight." We fell silent, the crackling of the fire suddenly louder in the stillness. "I'm turning in," Mike announced, draining the last of his whiskey. "Early start tomorrow, right?" We retired to our separate tents, the vastness of the wilderness suddenly more palpable in the darkness. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds, the gentle gurgle of the stream, the occasional hoot of an owl, the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. I must have drifted off because I awoke suddenly, fully alert. Something had changed. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no nocturnal rustling. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. Outside my tent, I heard the distinctive sound of footsteps. Not the four-legged gait of a deer or elk, but bipedal steps, careful and deliberate, circling our campsite. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The footsteps paused near my tent. I held my breath. Then they continued, moving away into the forest. The normal sounds of the night gradually returned, as if released from a spell. I told myself it was probably a curious bear, walking momentarily on hind legs to investigate our campsite. Or perhaps a forest ranger on night patrol, though I knew that was unlikely, given how remote we were. Either way, our food was properly stored in bear-proof containers away from the tents. We'd be fine. But as I drifted back to uneasy sleep, a third possibility occurred to me, one I quickly dismissed as irrational. What if Jason's stories had some basis in truth? Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the trees and condensation beating on our tents. As I emerged, stretching away the stiffness of night, I noticed something strange. A series of markings in the soft earth at the edge of our clearing. They resembled footprints, but oddly elongated and deeper at the toe than the heel, as if whatever made them had been running on the balls of its feet. I was still examining them when Mike emerged from his tent. "What have you got there?" he asked, coming to stand beside me. "Animal tracks," I said quickly, suddenly reluctant to voice my concerns. "Probably coyote." Mike frowned. "Those don't look like any coyote tracks I've seen." "We should get moving if we want to reach the ridge by midday," I said, changing the subject. As I turned to wake Jason, my gaze swept the tree line. For just an instant, I thought I saw a figure standing motionless among the distant pines, tall, unnaturally still, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. Just my imagination. It had to be. Yet as we broke camp and shouldered our packs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, assessed. The forest no longer felt welcoming. It felt like we were trespassing. And somewhere in the back of my mind, Jason's words echoed. The old-timers talked about skinwalkers, medicine men who'd gone bad, who could transform themselves into animals. They were said to stalk anyone who ventured too far into their territory. We were definitely in someone's, or something's, territory now. The day's hike took us deeper into the wilderness, following the contours of a narrow valley that wound between increasingly steep ridges. The terrain grew more challenging, the trail fading to little more than occasional game paths that required careful navigation. "You sure you know where we're going?" Jason asked as we paused to consult the map. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. "Roughly," I admitted. "This area isn't well mapped, but we're heading toward that ridge." I pointed to a distant line of cliffs visible through gaps in the trees. "There's supposedly an amazing viewpoint up there." Mike took a long drink from his water bottle. "I get the feeling we're the first people to hike through here in years." He wasn't wrong. The forest had a pristine quality that spoke of long isolation from human interference. Fallen trees lay where they had toppled decades ago, slowly being reclaimed by moss and fungi. In places, the undergrowth was so dense we had to navigate around it rather than push through. Around midday, we stopped in a small clearing for lunch. As I was digging through my pack for my food bag, I noticed Jason staring intently into the woods. "What is it?" I asked. "I keep seeing movement out of the corner of my eye," he said quietly. "Like something's pacing us just beyond the tree line." Mike rolled his eyes. "It's those skinwalker stories you were telling last night," Now you've got yourself spooked. Maybe, Jason conceded, but he didn't look convinced. I didn't mention that I'd had the same sensation all morning. A prickling awareness that we were being watched followed. Several times I'd turned quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing that feeling, but I'd seen nothing definitive. We continued our hike after lunch, the terrain growing steeper as we began ascending toward the ridge. The forest changed character as we climbed, the trees becoming more stunted and widely spaced, allowing broader views of our surroundings. It was during one of our rest breaks that I saw it, a strange arrangement of stones at the base of a lightning-struck pine. 7 smooth river rocks placed in a perfect circle, with a larger rock in the center. It was clearly deliberate, not any natural formation. "Hey guys, check this out," I called. Mike shrugged when he saw it. "Probably left by other hikers." "You said yourself we're likely the first people through here in years," I reminded him. Jason crouched to examine the stone circle more closely. "This doesn't look recent. These stones are partially embedded in the soil, like they've been here a long time." "Some kind of trail marker?" Mike suggested, though he sounded uncertain. "Maybe," I said, though something about the arrangement made me uneasy. It reminded me of boundary markers I'd seen on other tribal lands, warnings to go no further. We continued hiking, but the discovery of the stone circle had changed something. We talked less, each lost in our own thoughts, more attentive to our surroundings. I found myself constantly scanning the trees around us, that feeling of being observed growing stronger. As the afternoon wore on, we began encountering more unusual signs. A tree with deep gouges in its trunk, too high and too wide space to be from a bear. A deer carcass picked clean but with the bones arranged in an unnatural pattern. More stone circles appearing at increasingly frequent intervals. "Okay, this is getting weird," Mike finally admitted after we found 3 stone circles within 100 yards of each other. "We should turn back," Jason said, his earlier skepticism gone. "Head back to the campsite from last night, and then out to the trailhead tomorrow." I wanted to agree with him, but something pushed me forward, a mixture of curiosity and stubborn pride. "We're almost to the ridge. Let's at least make it there, set up camp, and we can head back in the morning." They reluctantly agreed, though the mood had shifted dramatically. We hiked in tight formation now, no longer spreading out as we'd done earlier. Every snapping twig or rustle in the undergrowth made us pause and look around. We reached the base of the ridge as the sun was beginning to set, its light turning the western sky a deep orange. The climb to the top would have to wait until morning. "Let's set up camp here," I suggested, indicating a relatively flat area with good visibility in all directions. As we unpacked our gear, I noticed that Mike kept looking over his shoulder. "Everything okay?" I asked him quietly. "I keep seeing something moving between the trees," he admitted, his voice low. "Just glimpses. It's tall, walking on 2 legs, but it doesn't move like a person." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "Probably just a deer standing on its hind legs to reach foliage," I said, not believing it myself. Mike gave me a look that said he wasn't buying it either. We built a larger fire than usual that night, none of us saying why, but all understanding the reason. As darkness fell completely, the forest around us came alive with sounds. Too many sounds. Too close. As if we were surrounded by creatures just beyond the reach of our firelight. "Anyone else notice how the wildlife seems unusually active tonight?" Jason asked, trying to keep his voice casual. I nodded, feeding another branch into the fire. "It's like they're agitated about something. Or someone," Mike added quietly. We ate in silence, the weight of the wilderness pressing in around us. Just as we were finishing, a long, wavering cry echoed through the valley. Not quite a wolf's howl, not quite a human scream, but something horrifyingly in between. We froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Mountain lion, I said quickly. They can sound almost human sometimes. That wasn't a mountain lion, Jason whispered, his face pale in the firelight. The cry came again, closer this time, followed by a series of yipping sounds that mimicked coyotes but weren't quite right. The rhythm was off, the pitch too deliberate. Whatever it is, it's mimicking animal sounds, Mike said, his voice tight with fear. Let's get in the tents, I suggested, trying to project a calmness I didn't feel. Animals are curious, but generally avoid humans. We'll be fine. None of us believed it, but we went through the motions, banking the fire, storing our food away from camp, retreating to our tents. I lay in my sleeping bag fully clothed, my hunting knife within easy reach, listening to the strange calls moving around our campsite. I must have dozed off despite my fear, because I jolted awake sometime later to absolute silence. My watch read 3:14 a.m. The night creatures had gone quiet again, just like the previous night. Then came the footsteps. The same bipedal gait I'd heard before, but no longer cautious. Whatever was out there was moving with purpose now, circling our camp in ever-tightening loops. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the steps came closer to my tent. They stopped just outside the thin fabric wall. I could hear breathing, ragged, wet, not quite human. Something pressed against the side of the tent. A hand or paw, pushing with enough force to bend the fabric inward. I clutched my knife, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard. The canvas wall bulged further, the pressure increasing. I prepared to slash at whatever was about to come through. Then, from across the campsite, came the sound of a tent zipper, Mike or Jason emerging from their shelter. The pressure against my tent immediately vanished. Rapid footsteps retreated into the forest, accompanied by the crack of breaking branches. "Hello?" came Mike's uncertain voice. "Is someone out there?" I unzipped my tent with shaking hands and emerged into the moonlit clearing. "Mike, you okay?" He stood by his tent, flashlight sweeping the tree line. Something was messing with my backpack. I heard it rummaging around. Jason emerged from his tent a moment later, looking disoriented from being suddenly awakened. "What's going on?" "We had a visitor," I said grimly, pointing my own flashlight toward the edge of our camp. In the soft earth were those same elongated footprints I'd seen that morning. But now there were dozens of them, circling our tents. And something else. A symbol scratched into the dirt. A crude stick figure with an animal head. None of us slept again that night. We rebuilt the fire and sat around it until dawn, jumping at every sound from the darkness beyond. As the first light of morning filtered through the trees, we made a unanimous decision without needing to discuss it. We were getting out of these woods today, viewpoint be damned. Something was stalking us, something that walked like a man but wasn't, and it was getting bolder. We broke camp at first light, packing quickly and with minimal conversation. The strange footprints were still visible in the morning dew, a stark reminder that last night's terror hadn't been a shared nightmare. "Should we try to hike all the way out today?" Jason asked as we shouldered our packs. I consulted the map, calculating distances. It's at least 15 miles back to the trailhead. With this terrain, I'm not sure we can make it before dark. Mike scanned the surrounding forest nervously. "I'd rather hike in the dark than spend another night out here." "Agreed," I said, folding the map. "We'll push as hard as we can, use headlamps if necessary." We set off at a rapid pace, retracing our route from the previous day. The forest felt different now, the beauty and serenity replaced by a sense of hostile watchfulness. Every shadow held potential threats. Every unexplained sound made us pause and look around. About an hour into our hike, Mike suddenly stopped. "Wait, this isn't right." I looked around, momentarily disoriented. He was correct. The landscape didn't match my memory from yesterday. The ridge that should have been on our left was now behind us. "We must have taken a wrong turn," I said, pulling out the map and GPS unit. Jason joined us, breathing heavily from the pace we'd been maintaining. "Where are we?" I studied the GPS coordinates with growing concern. According to the device, we were heading northeast, almost the opposite direction from the trailhead. "This can't be right," I muttered, tapping the unit. "We've been following our tracks from yesterday." "Have we?" Mike asked quietly. I looked down at the trail we'd been following. The impressions in the soft forest floor did resemble our boot prints, but examining them more closely, I noticed subtle differences. The tread pattern wasn't quite right, the spacing slightly off. "They're not our tracks," I admitted, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Then whose are they?" Jason asked. None of us wanted to voice the obvious question. What kind of creature could mimic human boot prints? I consulted the compass on my GPS unit, determined the correct direction, and set us on a new course. "This way. Keep your eyes open and stay close together." We moved more cautiously now, frequently checking our bearings. The terrain grew increasingly unfamiliar. Massive rock formations I didn't remember passing. Dense thickets that seemed impassable. "Something's wrong," Jason said after we'd been hiking for another hour. "It's like the landscape has changed overnight." "Or we're being led somewhere," Mike suggested, voicing what we'd all been thinking. The realization settled heavily upon us. Whatever was stalking us was intelligent, capable of strategy. It wasn't just following us, it was hurting us. Around midday, we emerged from a particularly dense section of forest into a small clearing and stopped abruptly. In the center stood a crude structure, a framework of branches lashed together with what looked like sinew draped with animal hides. The ground around it was littered with bones, deer, rabbit, and disturbingly, what appeared to be the jawbone of a much larger animal. "Is that human?" Jason whispered, pointing at the jawbone. "Too big," I said quickly. "Probably elk or moose." But the shape was wrong for either of those animals, and we all knew it. "We need to get out of here. Now," Mike urged, already backing away. As we turned to leave, movement caught my eye, something darting between trees at the far edge of the clearing. It was too quick for me to make out details, just an impression of height and unnatural thinness, moving with a jerky, loping gait. "Run!" I shouted, all pretense of calm evaporating. We crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely, driven by pure instinct to put distance between ourselves and that clearing. I could hear something moving through the forest behind us, not directly following but paralleling our course, occasionally crashing through the brush to drive us in a particular direction. It was hurting us again. I realized this too late. We emerged from the trees onto the edge of a steep ravine, nearly tumbling over before skidding to a halt. Below us, a rocky streambed wound through a narrow canyon, at least 100-foot drop with no safe way down. "We're trapped," Jason panted, looking frantically for an escape route. "It's driving us toward the reservation boundary," I realized, checking the GPS. "We're almost at the edge of public land." "So what?" "We cross it," Mike said urgently. "I'd rather apologize for trespassing than die out here." A series of sharp staccato sounds, like wood striking wood, echoed through the forest behind us. They came from multiple directions, suggesting we were surrounded. "Those are warning signals," Jason said, his face pale. "My grandfather described them. The Navajo Rangers use them to communicate in the forest without speaking." "Or something that's learned to mimic them does," I said grimly. We stood indecisively at the edge of the ravine, caught between the danger behind and the impossible descent before us. "There," Mike pointed suddenly. "About 50 yards downstream, the ravine wall looks less steep. We might be able to climb down there." It was a desperate option, but our only one. We moved along the edge of the ravine, constantly glancing back at the forest line. The wooden clacking sounds continued, always just out of sight, matching our pace. The spot Mike had identified was marginally better, a slope of about 70 degrees rather than a sheer drop, covered in loose scree and occasional stunted pines that might provide handholds. "I'll go first," I volunteered, slipping my backpack off and lowering it carefully ahead of me as I began the treacherous descent. The climb down was harrowing. Loose rocks dislodged under our feet, triggering small avalanches. Several times one of us would slip, saved only by grabbing onto exposed roots or the other's outstretched hands. By the time we reached the bottom, we were covered in dirt and minor cuts, but alive. The stream at the bottom of the ravine was shallow but swift, cutting through a narrow canyon of stratified red rock. It might provide a way out. Water always leads somewhere. "Downstream," I decided, pointing to where the canyon seemed to widen. "We'll follow the water." We had gone perhaps a quarter mile when Jason, who was bringing up the rear, called out in alarm. "Look, on the ridge." I turned to see a figure silhouetted against the afternoon sky at the edge of the ravine where we had started our descent. Even at this distance, something about its proportions was wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs slightly too long for its body. It stood perfectly still, watching us. "Don't run," I said quietly. "That's what it wants. It's been driving us like cattle." "What do we do?" Mike asked, his voice trembling slightly. "We keep moving, but deliberately. Stay together." We continued downstream, maintaining a steady pace, constantly aware of the figure watching from above. Occasionally it would disappear, only to reappear further along the ridge, having somehow traversed distances much faster than should have been possible. The canyon gradually widened, its walls becoming less steep. Eventually, we found a place where we could climb out, emerging onto a rolling landscape of pinyon pines and juniper. By now, the sun was low in the western sky. We'd been walking for hours, driven off our planned route with no clear idea of where we were in relation to the trailhead. "The GPS says we're about 8 miles from where we parked," I said, checking the unit. "But we'd have to cross back through that forest to get there." "No way," Jason said firmly. "We need another option." Mike unfolded the map. "Look, there's a ranger station marked here, on the eastern edge of the reservation. It's about 4 miles from our current position." "That's our best bet," I agreed. "We can explain our situation, maybe get a ride back to our car." We set off toward the ranger station, moving through increasingly open terrain as the sun began to set. The sense of being watched never left us, but the open landscape offered fewer hiding places for our stalker. As darkness fell, we were forced to use our headlamps, creating small pools of light in the vast darkness. The night sounds started up around us. Crickets, distant owl calls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures. Then, cutting through these familiar sounds, came that same cry we'd heard the previous night. Part howl, part scream, much closer now. It was answered by another from a different direction, then a third. "There's more than one," Mike whispered, his face ghostly in the reflected light of his headlamp. "Keep moving," I urged. "The ranger station can't be far now." We quickened our pace, pushing through exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. The cries continued, moving parallel to us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, creating the unmistakable impression that we were being circled. Then, through the trees ahead, I spotted a glimmer of light. Steady, artificial illumination. "There," I pointed. "That must be the ranger station." Relief surged through us, giving our tired legs new energy. We moved faster, the lights growing brighter, resolving into the outline of a small compound. A main building with a radio antenna, a couple of outbuildings, a parked truck. We were less than 100 yards away when the most horrifying sound yet tore through the night, a perfect imitation of a human voice, calling out in what sounded like my own voice. "Help! Over here! I'm hurt!" It came from the darkness to our right, so convincing that we instinctively turned toward it before realizing the deception. "Don't stop!" I shouted, pushing the others forward. "That's not a person!" We sprinted the final distance to the ranger station, the mimicked cries for help morphing into something else, a sound of rage and frustration that no human throat could produce. As we burst into the circle of light surrounding the station, the sounds abruptly ceased. The night beyond the light was silent, watching. I pounded on the door of the main building, praying someone was inside. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged Navajo man in a ranger uniform, his expression changing from annoyance to concern as he took in our disheveled, terrified appearance. "Please," I gasped. "Something's been stalking us in the forest. We need help." The ranger's face grew grave. He ushered us inside and locked the door firmly behind us. "You've crossed paths with something ancient," he said quietly. "Something that doesn't want you in its territory." As he spoke, something heavy slammed against the outer wall of the station, making us all jump. The ranger didn't seem surprised, just resigned, as if this was a situation he'd encountered before. "Don't worry," he assured us, though his eyes remained troubled. "It can't enter here, but we need to get you off the reservation by morning." Through the window, just at the edge of the station's security lights, I caught a glimpse of movement. A tall, emaciated figure that moved with unnatural quickness, circling the perimeter of the light. Its proportions were wrong, its movements jerky, yet purposeful. I only saw it clearly for an instant before it melted back into the darkness. But that glimpse was enough to haunt my nightmares for years to come. We were safe for now, but dawn was hours away, and beyond these walls, something waited, patient, intelligent, and utterly inhuman. The ranger station's interior was sparse but mercifully warm after our ordeal in the wilderness. A wood stove radiated heat from one corner, its glow providing most of the illumination in the main room. Maps covered one wall, a radio set up another. A door in the back presumably led to living quarters. The ranger, who introduced himself as Ben, offered us coffee from a pot that had been simmering on the stove. His calm demeanor was reassuring, though his eyes constantly darted to the windows, checking the darkness beyond. "You're lucky," he said as we warmed our hands around the mugs. "Not many people who encounter such things make it to safety." "You know what's out there?" Jason asked. Ben was silent for a moment, seemingly weighing his words carefully. "There are things in these forests that predate European settlement, predating even many native traditions. The Diné, what you call Navajo, have stories going back generations about entities that walk between worlds. Skinwalkers," I said quietly. His expression tightened. "We don't use that term carelessly, but yes, something like that." "Those are just stories," Mike insisted, though his voice lacked conviction after what we'd experienced. "Are they?" Ben asked mildly. "You saw something out there that stalked you systematically, that mimicked human voices, that understood how to herd you like prey. Does that sound like any natural animal you know?" None of us had an answer. "I've worked these forests for 27 years, Ben continued. Most of that time, things were quiet. But in the last decade, something's changed. The old ones are growing bolder, venturing beyond their traditional territories." "Why?" I asked. "Climate change, habitat destruction, increased human activity in remote areas. Take your pick." He shrugged. "The balance is shifting. They're adapting, perhaps more successfully than we are." Outside, something scraped against the metal siding of the station. Long, deliberate strokes, like claws being dragged across the surface. None of us acknowledged the sound, though we all heard it. "What can you tell us about what we encountered?" Jason asked, leaning forward. Ben hesitated. "Speaking of such things can attract their attention, but you've already crossed paths with it, so..." He sighed. The entity you encountered is known to the tribal elders as the one who watches from shadows. It's a mimic, a shapeshifter of sorts, though not in the way Hollywood portrays such things. What does it want? I asked. Territory, dominance, food. Ben's expression was grim. These beings were once medicine men who broke tribal taboos, using forbidden practices to gain power. The transformation corrupts them over time until little humanity remains. They're territorial predators now, seeing humans as either intruders or prey. You're saying it's some kind of... what? Supernatural cannibal? Mike asked incredulously. I'm saying there are things in this world that defy your understanding of natural, Ben replied evenly. Whether you call it supernatural, paranormal, or just unknown biology doesn't much matter when it's hunting you. Another sound from outside, that same wooden clacking we'd heard in the forest, now coming from multiple directions around the station. There are more of them out there, Ben said quietly, moving to check that the shutters were secure. They rarely gather in groups unless threatened, or very hungry. What do we do? Jason asked, panic edging into his voice. We wait for dawn. They're strongest at night, especially during the dark of the moon. Once daylight comes, I can drive you back to your vehicle. And if they attack before then? I asked. Ben moved to a cabinet against the far wall, unlocking it to reveal several shotguns and rifles. Conventional weapons can hurt them, though not always fatally. They're flesh and blood, despite what the stories say. But they're intelligent, patient, and nearly impossible to hit unless they want to be seen. He handed each of us a shotgun. I don't expect you'll need these inside, but just in case. The weight of the weapon was reassuring in my hands, though I wondered how effective it would actually be against what I'd glimpsed at the edge of the light. As the night deepened, the sounds outside the station intensified. Strange cries, mimicked voices calling out using our names and inflections, the constant scratching at the walls and roof. It was psychological warfare, designed to wear us down, to make us panic and flee into the darkness. How do you know so much about them? I asked Ben during a lull in the auditory assault. His expression grew distant. My grandfather was a tribal police officer back in the 70s. He responded to a series of disappearances in this same region. Hikers, campers, even a few locals who should have known better than to venture into certain areas alone. He tracked one of these entities for days, following a trail of mutilated wildlife and strange markings. Ben rolled up his sleeve to reveal a series of parallel scars running from wrist to elbow. He wasn't alone on that last night of tracking. I was 12, stubbornly tagging along despite his warnings. When it attacked our camp, he saved my life but lost his own. The terrible implication hung in the air. These creatures had been hunting in these forests for decades, perhaps centuries, largely unnoticed by the outside world. Why isn't this common knowledge? Mike asked. Why aren't there warnings? Ben gave a bitter laugh. Who would believe it? And those who might potentially believe, other tribal members, already know to avoid certain areas. As for the rest, evidence has a way of disappearing, and survivors like yourselves are usually dismissed as suffering from exposure, paranoia, or substance-induced hallucinations. Around 3 a.m., the attacks intensified. Something heavy slammed repeatedly against the door, testing its strength. The windows rattled in their frames as unseen entities pressed against them. The mimicry grew more sophisticated, perfect imitations of our voices having conversations, calling for help, screaming in pain. They're trying to draw us out, Ben explained, his voice steady despite the cacophony. Or make us so afraid we do something stupid. Like what? Jason asked. Before Ben could answer, a new sound cut through the chaos, the crack of breaking glass from the back of the station. The living quarters, Ben said sharply, grabbing his rifle. Stay here. He disappeared through the door at the back. Seconds later, we heard a shotgun blast. followed by an inhuman shriek of pain that quickly transmuted into rage. Ben backed into the main room, his rifle trained on the doorway. "They've broken the bedroom window. We need to barricade that door." We quickly dragged a heavy desk in front of the door, securing it as best we could. The shrieks continued from the back room, joined by sounds of destruction, furniture being overturned, glass shattering. "Did you hit it?" I asked. "Yes, but these entities are incredibly resilient," Ben replied, reloading his weapon. "It'll be back, and angrier." As if on cue, something hit the barricaded door with tremendous force, causing the desk to slide several inches across the floor despite our weight against it. "We can't stay here," Ben decided. "My truck is just outside the front door. If we make a run for it, we might be able to reach it before they can regroup." It was a desperate plan, but our options were dwindling. The barricaded door shuddered again under another impact, the wood beginning to splinter. "On my count," Ben said, moving to the front door with his keys in hand. 3, 2, 1, go. He threw open the door and we burst into the night, running for the truck parked about 20 yards away. The security lights around the station provided some visibility, but the darkness beyond seemed alive with movement. Tall, spindly shapes converging rapidly. Ben reached the truck first, unlocking it and jumping into the driver's seat. Mike was next, diving into the passenger side. Jason and I were only steps behind when something erupted from beneath the vehicle. A pale, emaciated figure that moved with terrifying speed. It caught Jason by the ankle, sending him sprawling. I turned back, firing the shotgun instinctively. The blast caught the creature in the shoulder, spinning it away from Jason with a spray of dark fluid that looked black in the artificial light. I grabbed Jason's arm, hauling him to his feet, and we scrambled into the truck's back seat as more shapes emerged from the darkness, converging on the vehicle. Ben gunned the engine, the truck's tires spinning in the dirt before finding traction. We lurched forward, narrowly missing one of the creatures that lunged for the driver's side door. As we accelerated away from the station, I caught a clear glimpse of our pursuers in the headlights. Gaunt, humanoid figures with unnaturally elongated limbs and distorted faces that seemed caught between human and animal features. Their skin was a sickly grayish white, stretched taut over prominent bones, and they moved with a jerky, unsettling gait that was nonetheless incredibly fast. "Don't look at them!" Ben shouted, noticing my horrified fascination. "Direct eye contact is dangerous. It's how they get in your head." I tore my gaze away, but not before seeing one of the creatures drop to all fours and begin pursuing the truck with impossible speed, keeping pace even as Ben pushed the vehicle to its limits on the rough forest road. "They can outrun a vehicle?" Mike asked incredulously. "For short distances," Ben confirmed grimly. "But they can't maintain that speed for long. If we can reach the main road, we'll be safe." The truck bounced violently as Ben navigated the uneven terrain, the headlights cutting a narrow swath through the darkness. In the side mirror, I could see our pursuers gradually falling behind, their forms becoming indistinct shapes in the darkness. But one remained, the largest of them, matching our pace with unnatural endurance. As if sensing my observation, it looked directly at the mirror, its eyes reflecting the taillight's glow with an eerie red luminescence. For a moment, just an instant, I felt a terrible pressure in my mind, as if something was trying to force its way in. Whispered thoughts that weren't my own suggested I should open the door, step out, join the hunt. "Look away!" Ben shouted, noticing my transfixed stare in the mirror. "It's trying to enthrall you." I wrenched my gaze forward, the pressure in my mind receding but leaving behind a lingering sense of violation. "What was that?" I gasped. "Mental influence," Ben explained tensely, navigating a sharp turn. "That's how they lure solitary hikers, making them hear things, see things, wander off trails. The strongest ones can briefly control susceptible minds if given the chance." The realization was terrifying. These weren't just physically dangerous predators, but psychically invasive ones, capable of manipulating perception and thought. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached a paved road. As soon as the truck's tires hit asphalt, the remaining pursuer pulled up short, standing at the edge of the forest. It raised one elongated arm in what almost seemed like a gesture of farewell, or perhaps a promise that our encounter wasn't truly over. "We're outside their territory now," Ben said, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he increased our speed on the improved road surface. They rarely cross certain boundaries, especially modern infrastructure like paved roads. "Where are we heading?" Jason asked, his voice shaky. "I'm taking you back to your vehicle," Ben replied. "It's about 30 miles from here. You should be there before dawn." As the adrenaline of our escape began to fade, exhaustion set in. But sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those gaunt figures, felt that alien presence trying to infiltrate my thoughts. "What happens now?" I asked Ben as we drove through the night. "You go home. Try to forget," he said simply. Few people ever encounter these entities and live to tell about it. Those who do often find their stories dismissed or ridiculed. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen," I protested. Ben glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "What's your alternative? Go public? You'll be labeled delusional. Try to prove it exists? Good luck. These beings have evaded scientific documentation for centuries. They know when they're being hunted, and they're far better at it than humans." His words settled heavily in the truck's cabin. He was right. We had no evidence beyond our traumatic experience and a few shotgun shells spent in the darkness. "All you can do," Ben continued more gently, "is warn others away from that area. Tell them it's dangerous terrain, mention mountain lion sightings, any plausible reason to keep people out. That's how we've protected both sides for generations." As we neared our parked vehicle, the eastern sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking over the distant mountains. The approaching daylight should have been comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd escaped with our lives only because something had allowed it. A predator confident in its territory, knowing we would return to our world carrying its legend, spreading fear that would keep its domain undisturbed. Ben pulled up beside our car, which sat alone in the small gravel parking area that marked the trailhead. "Thank you," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "You saved our lives." He nodded solemnly. "Be careful driving out. Get some rest in the nearest town before continuing home. And..." He hesitated. "Check yourselves and your belongings carefully. Sometimes they leave marks, ways of tracking those they've encountered." With that cryptic warning, he waited until we'd transferred to our own vehicle before turning his truck around and heading back toward the reservation. As Mike started the engine, I glanced back toward the forest we'd so narrowly escaped. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the tree line, tall, unnaturally still, watching our departure. I blinked, and it was gone. But as we drove away, I couldn't escape the certainty that our encounter with the Watcher in the shadows wasn't truly over, that once such entities fix their attention on you, some connection remains, spanning distance and time. And somewhere in those remote forests, ancient predators continued their patient vigil, waiting for the next unwary travelers to cross the invisible boundaries of their domain. 6 months passed since our encounter in the Navajo National Forest. On the surface, life had returned to normal. I was back at my corporate job, answering emails and attending meetings as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't glimpsed something that fundamentally altered my understanding of reality. Mike and Jason and I spoke less frequently now. Our weekly calls had dwindled to monthly, then occasionally. It wasn't a deliberate distancing, more a mutual unspoken agreement that reminders of our shared experience were too disturbing to face regularly. When we did speak, we never directly referenced what had happened. Instead, we talked around it, using coded language. "How are you sleeping these days?" None of us slept well anymore. Been hiking lately? None of us had. Any unusual visitors? A question that always raised the hair on my arms. The world felt different after the forest. Crowds made me anxious. Too many places for something to hide in plain sight. Darkness became intolerable without substantial artificial light. The sound of footsteps behind me on empty streets would send my heart racing, forcing me to turn and confront what was invariably just another pedestrian going about their business. I saw a therapist for a while, describing my symptoms as PTSD from a wildlife encounter during a camping trip. It wasn't entirely a lie. The coping mechanisms helped somewhat. Grounding techniques for panic attacks, meditation for the insomnia, exposure therapy for the fear of darkness. But nothing could erase what I'd seen. What troubled me most weren't the memories themselves, but the moments when I doubted them. In the harsh light of day, surrounded by the trappings of civilization, it was easy to rationalize our experience. Stress, exhaustion, and fear combining to create shared hallucinations. Perhaps we'd encountered a particularly clever predator, a mountain lion or wolf, and our minds had transformed it into something more sinister. But then night would fall, and with darkness came certainty. The things we'd seen were real. The ranger, Ben, had known about them. They had histories, behaviors, territories. They had been hunting humans for generations. And sometimes, in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I could still feel that alien presence scratching at the edges of my consciousness, as if something had followed me home from those remote forests. It was during one such restless night, about 7 months after our encounter, that I received a text from Jason. "Check your email. Important." The timestamp read 3:17 a.m., that dead hour of the night when the barrier between worlds feels thinnest. I opened my laptop, ignoring the irrational fear that something might be watching through the camera, and found Jason's email waiting with a video attachment. His message was brief. "Hiking forum. Guy went missing in the same area 3 weeks ago. Search team found his GoPro yesterday. Watch the last 40 seconds. The video began normally enough. Standard hiking footage of a young man documenting his solo trek through beautiful wilderness. The timestamp indicated it was from early April, the forest just beginning to green with spring. His narration was typical enthusiastic outdoorsman fare, pointing out interesting plants, commenting on the weather, occasionally consulting his map. Around the 2-minute mark, his demeanor subtly changed. He began glancing over his shoulder more frequently, commenting on strange noises off camera. By minute 5, his pace had quickened, his breathing more labored as he pushed deeper into increasingly dense forest. "Something's been paralleling my trail for the last mile," he said tensely to the camera. "Probably just a deer, but it's weird how it stops when I stop." The footage continued, the hiker growing visibly more agitated as shadows lengthened with the approaching evening. He decided to make camp earlier than planned, setting up his tent in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. Night fell, the camera's infrared mode engaging, giving the footage an eerie greenish cast. The hiker was inside his tent now, camera pointed at his face as he whispered his growing concerns. "There's something moving around the campsite. I keep hearing footsteps, but when I shine my light, nothing's there. Going to try to get some footage." The camera turned toward the tent entrance as he slowly unzipped it, pointing the lens into the darkness beyond. At first, nothing was visible except trees swaying slightly in the breeze. Then came the last 40 seconds Jason had mentioned. A sound became audible, the same wooden clacking we'd heard during our ordeal. The hiker whispered, "What the hell is that?" as he panned the camera slowly across the clearing. And there, at the edge of the infrared's range, stood a figure. Even with the video's poor quality and the limitations of night filming, its wrongness was immediately apparent. Too tall, too thin, limbs slightly too long for its body. It stood perfectly still, watching the tent. The hiker gasped, the camera shaking with his fear. Holy shit, he whispered. There's someone out there. As if in response to his voice, the figure's head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then, with a jerky, unsettling motion, it began moving toward the tent, not walking so much as gliding, covering ground with impossible speed. The hiker cursed, dropping the camera as he scrambled backward. The footage showed only the tent ceiling for several seconds, the audio capturing his panicked breathing and the sound of something moving around the outside of the tent. A deliberate circling, punctuated by that same wooden clacking, now coming from multiple directions. Then silence. After a long moment, the hiker slowly retrieved the camera, pointing it toward the tent entrance again. Nothing was visible outside now. I think it's gone, he whispered, relief evident in his voice. He began to lower the camera, and that's when it happened. The tent wall behind him bulged inward, a hand-shaped impression pressing through the fabric. The hiker didn't notice, still focused on the tent entrance. The impression deepened, the fabric stretching to its limit. Then, with a swift, violent motion, long fingers punctured through the material, wrapping around the hiker's shoulder. He screamed, the camera capturing a blurred image of his terrified face as he was yanked backward with tremendous force. The camera tumbled to the ground, recording several seconds of chaotic movement and the hiker's diminishing screams before cutting to static. I sat in stunned silence, my body cold with recognition. It was the same entity, or one just like it, that had stalked us through those forests. The same hunting methodology, the same physical characteristics, the same territory. My phone buzzed with another text from Jason. Called the sheriff's department in that county. They've found no trace of him beyond the camera. Search called off yesterday. I typed back with shaking fingers. Same thing that came after us. Jason's response came quickly. It's still out there, and there will be more hikers this summer. The implication was clear. What responsibility did we bear, knowing what lurked in those forests? We'd escaped, kept silent, tried to forget. And now someone else had died in the same area. After a long moment, I texted, "What can we do?" No one would believe us. Jason's reply took longer this time. I've been researching, found similar incidents going back decades. Different forests, same MO. These things have territories across multiple states. People disappear. Searches find nothing. Cases go cold. I stared at the message, the full implications sinking in. This wasn't isolated to that one forest. These entities, whatever they were, had ranges that spanned vast wilderness areas, hunting grounds where humans occasionally ventured and sometimes never returned. Another text from Jason. I'm going back, not to the same spot. Boundary areas. Need to understand more. Document everything. That's suicide, I typed frantically. Not going alone, came his reply. Meeting someone who knows things. Former Forest Service. Lost a partner to one of these things in Wyoming, 1997. Says there are ways to protect yourself. I sat with that information, torn between fear for my friend and the gnawing guilt of inaction. Finally, I texted. When? 2 weeks. You in? The rational part of my brain screamed no, to stay away, to forget, to embrace the safety of denial. But deeper than rationality was the certainty that what we'd encountered had fundamentally changed us. We couldn't unknow what we now knew. We couldn't unsee what we'd seen. And if these entities were hunting across multiple wilderness areas, how many more people would vanish without explanation? How many search parties would find nothing but abandoned campsites and inexplicable tracks? How many families would never have closure? I thought of the ranger, Ben, and how he dedicated his life to protecting people from threats most couldn't comprehend or acknowledge. I thought of his grandfather, who had died facing these entities to save his grandson. Some knowledge carries responsibility. I'm in, I typed, but we need Mike too. Already asked him, Jason replied. He said he needs time to think about it. I understood Mike's hesitation. He had a wife, a young daughter, responsibilities that went beyond his own safety. He had the most to lose. But he also understood what we were facing better than most. And 3 days later, when he finally texted both Jason and me, his message was simple. Can't let you two idiots get yourselves killed without me. I'm in. We spent the next week gathering equipment, consulting with Jason's new contact, preparing for what would certainly be the most dangerous undertaking of our lives. We weren't delusional enough to think we could hunt these entities. They were apex predators in their domain, with advantages we could barely comprehend. But we could document, map territories, identify patterns, create warnings that might save lives. The night before our departure, I stood at my window, looking out at the city lights that had once represented safety and civilization. Now I understood them as merely temporary barriers against ancient forces that had never truly retreated, just withdrawn to wait. Movement in the shadows of the building across the street caught my eye. A tall, unnaturally thin figure standing perfectly still, watching my window. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of light and shadow, or perhaps my overwrought imagination. But as I turned away from the window, a familiar pressure brushed against my consciousness. That same alien presence I'd felt in the forest, trying to work its way into my thoughts. They knew we were coming back. Perhaps they'd always known we would return. Perhaps they'd been patiently waiting, watching from the shadows of our civilized world, biding their time. Tomorrow we would venture back into their territory, armed with knowledge, technology, and determination. Whether we would emerge again remained to be seen. But as I packed the last of my gear, including a journal documenting everything we'd experienced and learned, I felt a grim resolve replacing the paralyzing fear that had haunted me for months. Some threats remain hidden because no one survives to report them. Others remain hidden because survivors aren't believed. But truth has a power of its own, accumulating slowly over time, impossible to fully suppress. The Watchers had existed in shadow for centuries, hunting with impunity. But shadows recede when exposed to light, and we were bringing lights into their darkness. Cameras, journals, GPS trackers, communication devices. They were ancient and powerful in their domain, but they had never faced prey that returned deliberately, knowingly, with purpose. As I finally drifted toward uneasy sleep, one thing became clear. Our first encounter with the Watcher in the shadows had been on its terms. Our return would be on ours. And this time, we wouldn't be running away.